History is full of people dying in absolutely horrible ways. Seriously, you'd think there was someone running around handing out awards to people who were finding the most brutal or creative ways to murder other people. Now, Tolkien isn't necessarily known for handing out overly brutal deaths to his characters, that's more of a George R.R. Martin thing. But nevertheless, it did happen from time to time. So in this video, I want to bring attention to some of the most brutal deaths in Tolkien's Legendarium. Now, brutality isn't a unit of measurement, so this list is totally subjective. When looking at characters' deaths, I basically just decided to ask myself a question. Would I like to be them in that situation? The answer is pretty much always no, but there are different levels of no. For example, would I like to throw myself into lava or be crushed by a Mumakil? No, but I would certainly take it over other options. This list isn't in any particular order, but I saved the worst for last. The first death I wanted to mention is Finduilas, daughter of King Orodreth of Nargothrond. During the fall of Nargothrond, Finduilas was taken prisoner alongside many others. These captives were being led back to Angband by a column of orcs when they passed near the borders of the Forest of Brethil. Naturally, the men of the House of Haleth attacked the orcs, and the orcs responded by killing as many of the captives as they could, choosing first the women. Finduilas was pinned to a tree with a spear. She remained alive through the rest of the battle and lived long enough to tell her attempted saviors to tell Turin Turambar that she had died here. Now, this isn't particularly brutal, but I felt like I had to add it all the same. Unlike some of the other women in Tolkien's work, Finduilas wasn't particularly strong. She was very much a damsel in distress type figure who unfortunately lived in the wrong place at the wrong time. She's an example of the horror of war. For every great warrior who dies heroically in battle, there's hundreds of innocents who perish as well, some of whom get speared to a tree. Speaking of Finduilas, she had a brother, Rennion Gil-galad, the fourth and last High King of the Noldor. Now, I've mentioned the High Kings of the Noldor in other videos, and one thing I always try to mention is that none of them ruled overly long, and all of them died rather horribly. Now, Gil-galad did rule for a long time, and he ruled over the most peaceful period that the elves ever experienced in Middle-earth. But there was a price to pay, because although Gil-galad ruled longer than his predecessors, he outdid them with his death. In the War of the Last Alliance, in an attempt to win the war, Sauron made his last roll of the dice, and engaged both Gil-galad and Elendil in combat on the slopes of Mount Doom. All three of them were dead by the end. Sauron died of wounds received, Elendil seems to have died from some sort of impact as his sword was broken beneath him, but Gil-galad, in the words of Isildur, who witnessed the fight, died much more horribly. The ring Miseth may be the heat of Sauron's hand, which was black and yet burned like fire, and so Gil-galad was destroyed. That doesn't paint a pretty picture. So basically, at some point in the fight, Gil-galad was caught by Sauron and seems to have been burned to death, so badly that Isildur used the word destroyed. I think we can all agree that immolation is a pretty bad way to go, and for that reason, you might occasionally hear people call him Gil-galad. Gil-galad wasn't the only one to die a terrible death at Sauron's hands. Thousands of years earlier, a poor fellow named Celebrimbor also met his end. Celebrimbor was the grandson of Feanor, and is most famous for his role in the creation of the Rings of Power, after he was deceived by Sauron. When Celebrimbor figured out the deception, Sauron got angry and attacked Eregion, home of Celebrimbor, triggering the War of the Elves and Sauron. Celebrimbor went down fighting, but was captured alive and brought before Sauron. Celebrimbor was put to torment, because Sauron wanted to know the location of the 3 Elven Rings. Celebrimbor was willing to give up the 7 rings Sauron hadn't already found, but refused to give up the 3. Deciding he was no longer useful, Sauron had Celebrimbor put to death. We're not sure how exactly, but when Sauron marched against Elrond's force, Celebrimbor's body was hung upon a pole, shot through with orc arrows, and was used as a banner, so maybe he met his death by orc firing squad. I wonder if we'll see that in Rings of Power. Celebrimbor wasn't the only one to die a terrible death at Sauron's hands. Wait, I've used that one before, but it's true. Thousands of years earlier, a poor fellow named Gorlim the Unhappy met his end. Gorlim was a member of Barahir's band, a group of outlaws who continued the fight against Morgoth despite the fact their lands were overrun. Gorlim had a particularly sad story. His wife had been killed during the war, and he often visited their old homestead in memory. Unfortunately for him, Sauron learned of this and he set a trap. he summoned a phantom of Gorlim's wife and had her appear in the window of the homestead. When Gorlim arrived, he was shocked and walked blindly into a trap. Sauron told him that if he revealed everything he knew, then he would reunite Gorlim with his wife. Gorlim, ensnared by the thought and cowed by Sauron's gaze, reluctantly revealed all. Sauron thanked him, told him that his wife was actually dead, and then proceeded to kill him. Ice cold. Now, while this isn't physically brutal, it's definitely emotionally brutal, and just goes to show how awful Sauron was. And by the way, this was when Sauron was still sort of redeemable. He captured a grieving man by summoning an image of his dead wife, and then tricked him into betraying his friends by using a play on words. And before killing him, he literally mocked him and rubbed in the fact that his wife was dead. Truly a dick move. Alright, moving away from Sauron, let's talk about a death that is far more familiar. And it also involves burning to death. Yes, I'm talking about Steward Denethor II of Gondor. As everyone probably knows, Denethor gradually gave into despair through use of the Palantir, and the apparent mortal wound of his son, Faramir, was enough to finally break him. He decides to cremate himself and Faramir, while both of them are still alive. Now, this moment was changed in the Peter Jackson films. Faramir is saved, and then Gandalf sort of accidentally, purposely murders Denethor by using Shadowfax to knock him into the flames. Denethor has a final feel-good moment when he notices Faramir is still alive before catching on fire. And then it sort of turns into a comedy because despite being on fire, Denethor manages to run hundreds of meters and then throws himself off the top of Minas Tirith. The scene in the books is far darker. The fire hasn't been lit when Gandalf, Beregond, and Pippin save Faramir. When Beregond stops Denethor from getting to his son, Denethor raves a little more, and instead lights the fire himself and lies down atop the stone table, Palantir in hand, waiting for the fire to consume him. Gandalf turns away, and the last thing he hears is a great cry echo from inside the tomb. So yeah, in the books, Denethor willingly lies there waiting to burn to death. And it was said that afterwards, if someone looked into the Anor stone, unless they had enough strength to bend it to their will, all they would see was two aged hands withering in the flames. Another death, well, actually two deaths that are brutal and also very sad, are that of Elured and Elurin, the twin sons of Dior, second king of Doriath. When Dior ended up with a Silmaril, the sons of Feanor invoked the Oath of Feanor and demanded that Dior hand it over. Dior refused, and as a result, the Feanorians launched a surprise assault on Doriath. During this battle, 3 of Feanor's sons perished, Celegorm being slain by Dior himself. However, Dior was also killed, and the Feanorians were victorious, although they did not manage to retrieve the Silmaril. Elured and Elurin, merely 6 years old, survived the battle, but Celegorm's cruel servants, looking to avenge their master's death, took the boys out into the woods and left them there. Later on, Maedhros, the eldest son of Feanor, looks to repent and searches for the 2 boys, but he finds nothing. Some legends say that birds saved the boys and led them to the friendly land of Osiriand where they survived, but given they were never actually seen again, it's very likely that they either starved to death or died of exposure. 6 years old, by the way, fun. And finally, we come to our last death, and this is one that you probably wouldn't expect from Tolkien. In the Dagobah Galak, an elf lord of Nargothrond named Gelmir was captured by Morgoth's forces and enslaved in Angband. 17 years later, before the Nenei Arnothiad, the next great battle of the First Age, Gelmir is brought forth as a hostage before the army of High King Fingon. At this point, he's already been blinded, but it gets worse. The orcs proceed to cut off his hands, then his feet, and finally his head in full view of the army. You know when a character dies in a LEGO game? That's Gelmir. What makes this worse is that Gwyndor, Gelmir's brother, had led a company of soldiers from Nargothrond, with the intention of saving his brother. By ill chance, he was in the vanguard of the army, and seeing this, he took his men and prematurely attacked. Although they actually made it into Angband itself, they were all killed, and Gwyndor was captured. The battle ended up being a complete disaster for the elves and the Edain, and Gwyndor never had the opportunity to avenge his brother, dying 20 years later at the Battle of Tumhalad. This, in my opinion, is the most brutal death in Tolkien's Legendarium. Thank you for watching. I don't hope you enjoyed this, because that would be weird. Although I don't mind if you found it interesting. Then again, if you did enjoy this makes me an enabler, which is pretty bad as well. Tolkien often gets placed as relatively PG, light-hearted fantasy, but if you've read the Silmarillion or the Children of Hurin, You would know this isn't true most of the time. Anyways, cheers, farewell, and remember, dying horribly might suck, but dying boringly is worse.